The fluorescent hum of the office was a familiar lullaby, a constant, low thrum against the relentless click of my keyboard. Each digit I entered, each ledger I scrutinized, was a thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of global finance. I was Thomas, a forensic accountant, and my world was one of absolute precision, where every decimal point held a truth, every omission a lie waiting to be unearthed. My desk, a polished expanse of dark wood, bore the weight of client files stacked in meticulous columns, each bound with the firm's embossed crest. The air, conditioned to a perpetual chill, carried the faint scent of ozone and stale coffee. Today, my focus was the accounts of Cerulean Holdings, a high-profile client whose investments spanned continents. The senior partner had personally handed me the dossier, his gaze a silent instruction for thoroughness. "Clean as a whistle, Thomas," he'd murmured. But a second pair of eyes never hurts. I had nodded, acknowledging the unspoken pressure that came with such a prestigious name. I began with the quarterly reports, a familiar dance through revenue streams and expenditure logs. My fingers moved with practiced grace across the number pad, inputting figures, cross-referencing against bank statements, flagging minor discrepancies that were usually just clerical errors. For hours, the rhythm was unbroken, a soothing cascade of verification. The sun, a pale disk behind the urban haze, began its slow descent, painting the skyscraper windows opposite in hues of muted orange and gray. My colleagues had begun to trickle out, their goodbyes echoing softly in the now expansive quiet. It was in the third tier of subsidiary accounts, buried deep within a convoluted web of offshore transfers, that the first tremor struck. A series of payments, ostensibly for consulting services, caught my eye, not because of their individual amounts, they were modest enough to evade automated flags, but because of their sheer volume and their recipient, a shell corporation registered in a jurisdiction known for its opacity. My brow furrowed. I'd seen this before, of course, but usually with a more transparent paper trail, an eventual beneficiary that could be traced back to a legitimate entity. This felt different. I highlighted the entries, a small, vibrant green against the stark black and white of the digital ledger. A minor anomaly, perhaps, a simple oversight in a firm that handled billions. My rational mind sought to dismiss it, to attribute it to a harmless, if slightly unconventional, business practice. My fingers, usually so steady, hesitated over the next set of numbers. I dug deeper, past the quarterly summaries, and into the raw data, the daily transaction logs. The consulting payments, I discovered, were not isolated. The amounts were small, precise, almost identical in their irregularity. It was like watching a perfectly synchronized, silent ballet of illicit funds, each step carefully choreographed to avoid notice. This was no error. This was deliberate, a meticulously constructed financial illusion. I traced the flow, mapping it out on a separate, secure interface. The funds from Cerulean Holdings would go to subsidiary A, then to Shell Company X. Simultaneously, funds from subsidiary B would go to Shell Company Y. Then, in a seemingly unrelated sequence, Shell Company X would transfer a slightly altered sum to Shell Company Z, and Shell Company Y would do the same, all within a narrow window of time. The ultimate destination, after 3 or 4 such hops, was always a holding account under a generic name, a digital dead end. The individual sums were small, but when aggregated, they amounted to a substantial fortune. It was a slow bleed, designed to be imperceptible, a constant siphon from the legitimate revenues of Cerulean Holdings. A river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, the current tugging, insistent, threatening to pull me under. The air tasted of salt and fear. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a shiver that had nothing to do with the office's regulated temperature. A premonition, perhaps, of some future burden, some difficult passage. I shook my head, forcing the spectral vision from my mind, returning my gaze to the screen. The pattern was too clean, too consistent. It wasn't the sloppiness of embezzlement. It was the calculated precision of a professional operation. This wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system, artfully concealed. My jaw tightened. My meticulous nature, usually a source of quiet satisfaction, now felt like a dangerous compass pointing into a storm. What I had stumbled upon was far more sinister than a simple accounting discrepancy. It was a labyrinth, and I had just found the first loose stone. The office was silent now, save for the rhythmic whir of the server and the increasingly rapid pulse in my ears. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. My determination, usually a quiet hum, now resonated with a sharper, more urgent tone. I had found something, and now it felt like something had found me. I was Thomas, a forensic accountant, and my world was one of a delicate balance, a symphony of numbers that usually resolved into harmonious, if sometimes complex, patterns. But for weeks, a dissonant chord had echoed through the data, a discordant note that refused to be silenced. My fingers danced over the keys, a blur of motion driven by an almost frantic energy. The screen glowed, a canvas of spreadsheets and cross-referenced accounts, each line a whisper, each sum a shout. I had followed the breadcrumbs, tiny digital trails leading from shell corporations in offshore havens to legitimate-looking businesses right here in the city, like veins of poison spreading through a healthy body. The pattern was undeniable, stark, and terrifyingly efficient. Millions, laundered through a sophisticated network, scrubbed clean, and reintroduced into the legitimate economy. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was an octopus, its tentacles reaching far and wide. This wasn't just a mistake, a clerical oversight, malicious, a grand deception woven into the very fabric of the financial world I helped to uphold. My breath hitched, the weight of it pressed down, a silent, invisible burden. I stared at the final, damning summary on my monitor, the red flags screaming louder than any siren. I had to tell someone. The firm prided itself on its integrity, its rigorous ethical standards. My manager, a man whose desk was perpetually buried under stacks of paper, would surely understand the gravity of this. He was a stickler for rules, a man who believed in the sanctity of the ledger. With a printed stack of my findings clutched tightly in my hand, my grip tight, I walked to his office. The door was ajar, a sliver of light escaping the cluttered space. He looked up, his brow furrowed, a faint scent of stale coffee clinging to him. "Thomas," he grunted, adjusting his spectacles. "Something urgent." I laid the reports on his desk, carefully fanning them out like a hand of cards. "Sir, I've uncovered something significant, a complex money laundering operation. The scale is unprecedented in my experience." I pointed to the convoluted flowcharts, the highlighted transactions, the connections to known tax havens. My voice, usually calm and measured, carried an edge of urgency I hadn't intended. He picked up a sheet, skimming the columns, eyes moving with a practiced speed. Interesting, very thorough, Thomas, as always." He tapped a pen against his teeth. "But these figures, they seem to be isolated incidents, perhaps a series of unfortunate coincidences, a few rogue clients, perhaps." He waved a dismissive hand. "We deal with large sums, Thomas. Anomalies occur." "Sir, these aren't anomalies. I've tracked the funds through 3 different shell companies, cross-referenced with public records of their directors. The same names appear, linked to an international holding group with a dubious history. It's a systemic pattern, not a coincidence." My voice was firmer now, pushing against his casual dismissal. He sighed, pushing the papers back towards me. "Look, Thomas, I appreciate your diligence, truly, but chasing down every phantom connection can be a rabbit hole. We have deadlines, major audits pending. Let's not get sidetracked by what could very well be a misinterpretation. Perhaps the data is incomplete." He offered a tight, professional smile. "File it away, make a note, but let's focus on the bigger picture, shall we? Misinterpretation, incomplete data." I had checked and rechecked, cross-referenced every single data point. The manager's casual dismissal felt like a deliberate deflection, a subtle warning dressed in professional courtesy. But he wasn't the top. Perhaps he was just overworked, unwilling to deal with a messy complication. My resolve hardened. This was too big to ignore. I needed to go higher. To the senior partner, a man whose portrait hung in the lobby, a symbol of the firm's unwavering commitment to integrity. His office, unlike the manager's cluttered den, was a study in minimalist power. He sat behind a gleaming mahogany desk, his posture impeccable, an aura of quiet authority surrounding him. He gestured for me to sit, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Thomas," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "My manager mentioned I had some concerns, something about a few transactions." I laid out my findings again, this time with a more concise, impactful presentation. I highlighted the magnitude of the funds, the intricate web of deceit, the undeniable links. I watched his face for any flicker of shock, any sign of shared outrage. There was none, only a practiced stillness. He listened, occasionally nodding, his fingers steepled under his chin. Your analytical skills are unparalleled. That's why I'm confident you'll understand when I say, sometimes, in a firm of our stature, with clients of such global reach, we must exercise discretion. My stomach clenched. Discretion? These are delicate relationships, he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, devoid of warmth. Our reputation, our very existence, rests on trust, and sometimes a zealous pursuit of every minute detail can disrupt that trust. A very promising one. We value loyalty, discretion. We value employees who understand the bigger picture, who know when to focus their considerable talents on more productive avenues. The words hung in the air, a silken noose tightening around my throat. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an unequivocal command, a threat thinly veiled in corporate jargon. My considerable talents were to be redirected. My discovery was a liability. A sudden, vivid image crashed into my mind, a river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders. The burden of heavy sacks digging into my flesh, the slippery stones beneath my bare feet, the solitary struggle against an indifferent current. That was how I felt now, standing alone against a powerful, unseen force, laden with a truth too heavy to bear, yet too dangerous to drop. Clear my head. Perhaps reevaluate my priorities. We wouldn't want anything to jeopardize my future here. This wasn't just about a few rogue clients. This was about the firm itself. The corruption reached higher, far higher than I had dared to imagine. It wasn't an external threat. It was an internal rot. The very structure I had trusted, that I had devoted my life to, was compromised. The warning was clear. The battle had just begun. The rot, I had called it, and the word felt like a living thing. A cancerous growth, consuming the very marrow of the firm I had once revered. My clarity, born of that chilling realization, had solidified into a stubborn resolve. To walk away now would be to surrender to the shadows, to allow the insidious tendrils of corruption to tighten their grip unchallenged. This was no longer just about numbers on a ledger. It was about a violation, a betrayal of trust that resonated deep within me, a quiet fury simmering beneath my calm exterior. I couldn't trust the internal systems, the very digital pathways I had once navigated with such confident precision. The official channels, once my recourse, were now part of the problem, a poisoned well. My investigation then had to be a ghost, a whisper in the data stream, a shadow in the archives. I started small with the periphery, accounts I'd flagged months ago as merely unusual, dismissed then as quirks of international finance. Late at night, long after the last colleague had departed, leaving the building to the hum of servers and the sigh of the ventilation system, I would begin. My screen, a solitary beacon in the cavernous office, became my canvas of conspiracy. I bypassed the firm's secure network for my own encrypted laptop, connecting only when absolutely necessary, a digital dive into the deep end, each click a potential ripple. I traced the flow, not just of money, but of information. Shell corporations, a familiar tactic, but these were woven with an artistry I hadn't appreciated before. Layers upon layers, like an onion, each skin peeled revealing another, identical yet distinct. A shipping company in Panama, a real estate holding group in Luxembourg, a textile manufacturer in Singapore, all seemingly disparate, yet a faint, almost imperceptible thread, a common director here and shared accounting firm there, began to emerge. The names, when I managed to cross-reference them, were often generic or recycled, like props in a poorly staged play, but the addresses sometimes held the key. A dusty industrial park in the outskirts of a forgotten city, an anonymous post office box in a bustling metropolis, each a tiny node in a vast, sprawling web. One evening, a particular series of transactions caught my eye, linking a newly established import-export business to a struggling local fishery. The numbers didn't reconcile. The fishery, by all accounts, was barely treading water, yet it was receiving substantial payments for consulting services from the import-export firm. And the import-export firm itself, while showing healthy revenues, had no discernible physical presence beyond a virtual office and a single, constantly forwarded phone line. It didn't add up. The payments were too large, the services too vague, the connection too forced. It was a classic washing machine tactic, but the scale suggested more than just a local operation. This was a channel, a conduit. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a silent dance with data. I pulled up public records, corporate filings, news articles, anything that could give substance to these phantom entities. The fishery, Ocean's Bounty, was situated near a stretch of coast known for its treacherous tides and a network of small, isolated coves. What if the fish wasn't fish at all? The next day, under the guise of an overdue weekend trip, I found myself driving a rental car down a winding coastal road, the ocean a restless gray expanse to my left. The air grew heavy with the scent of brine and damp earth. I left the car hidden amongst a copse of wind-stunted pines and continued on foot, a backpack slung over my shoulders, containing not hiking gear, but a pair of high-powered binoculars, a long-lens camera, and my encrypted tablet. The path deteriorated into a muddy track, eventually disappearing into a dense thicket of sea-battered scrub. I pushed through, twigs snagging at my clothes, the rhythmic crash of waves growing louder. My destination was a vantage point I'd located on a topographical map, overlooking a specific inlet, rumored to be impassable except during the lowest tides. It was a desperate gamble, a venture far beyond the sterile confines of my spreadsheets. I reached the bluff just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. Below, the inlet was a ribbon of exposed mudflats and glistening rocks. The tide was ebbing, revealing the raw, scarred face of the coastline. And then I saw them, figures small and distant, emerging from a hidden cove further down the coast. They were moving swiftly, purposeful, burdened. They navigated the exposed flats, their silhouettes stark against the twilight sky. They moved with a practiced rhythm, carefully picking their way across the slick, uneven terrain. This was the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, not a river in the traditional sense, but the sea itself, momentarily pushed back to expose a clandestine pathway. My breath hitched. The cargo was too uniform, too heavy to be natural produce from a struggling fishery. It was packaged, contained. Contraband. I brought the binoculars to my eyes, the world snapping into sharp focus. The men were rough-hewn, their movements economical. They converged on a single point, a small, unmarked warehouse nestled against the cliff face, almost invisible from the sea. The transfer was quick, efficient. Boxes were exchanged for bags, heavy with something other than fish. My lens clicked, capturing the fleeting moments, the grainy truth. This was raw, visceral. These weren't just numbers on a screen. These were real people, moving real illicit goods, under the cover of a desolate landscape, protected by the very firm I worked for. The sophistication of the operation wasn't just in the financial layering, but in its physical execution, its seamless integration into the natural world, exploiting its harshness. As the last of the figures disappeared into the warehouse and the van rumbled away into the deepening gloom, I lowered my binoculars, my hands trembling slightly. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The struggling fishery, the phantom import-export firm, the consulting fees, and now this, the physical manifestation of the laundering scheme. The fish was a smokescreen for the movement of something far more valuable, far more dangerous. I was no longer just an accountant, I was a witness. I had stepped out of the abstract world of ledgers and into the tangible, dangerous reality of their operation. The firm wasn't just facilitating. It was deeply embedded, a vital artery in this clandestine network. The internal rot was deeper, more extensive than I could have ever conceived. My initial doubt, the fleeting thought that I might be overreacting, dissolved under the weight of what I had seen. There was no turning back. The path ahead was treacherous, and the cargo I now carried, the truth of it all, felt heavier than any physical burden. To walk away now would be to surrender to the shadows, to allow the insidious tendrils of corruption to tighten their grip unopposed. I would not be the quiet accountant who simply turned a blind eye. I would be the thorn in their side, the meticulous unraveler of their threads, even if the tapestry threatened to pull apart with me entangled within. My days became a duality. By sunlight, I was Thomas, the diligent forensic accountant, sifting through ledgers, attending meetings, nodding in polite agreement. I moved with a new precision. Each keystroke, each printed page, a deliberate step in a dangerous dance. My home office, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, transformed into a war room. I learned to keep my gaze low, my movements fluid, a conscious effort to appear unremarkable, even as my internal landscape churned with a burgeoning rebellion. The first tremor of unease arrived as subtly as a breath on a cold windowpane. It was a black sedan, parked 3 blocks from my apartment, its tinted windows mirroring the gray morning sky. I saw it once, dismissed it as coincidence. Then twice, in a different location, but always within a plausible orbit of my routine. I started to vary my routes, to take circuitous detours, observing my own reflection in sharp windows, searching for an echo. Then came the face. A man of unremarkable features, dressed in neutral tones, always on the periphery. He was in the coffee shop line one morning, a few paces behind me. Later that week, I spotted him across the street from the firm's entrance, ostensibly waiting for a bus that never seemed to arrive. He never stared, never gestured, simply existed in my peripheral vision, a static hum in the background of my days. My mind, trained to detect anomalies in financial data, now applied its rigor to the mundane patterns of urban life. The man was an anomaly. His presence, too consistent, too close, felt like a tightening cord around my awareness. Was I imagining it? There was the stress of my secret investigation bending the reality around me. The thought gnawed, a tiny rodent in the quiet chambers of my resolve. The psychological pressure escalated, a slow, deliberate turning of the screw. One evening, after a particularly long day spent tracing a phantom offshore entity, I returned to my apartment to find my front door undisturbed, the lock secure. Yet, a single stark white lily lay on my doormat. Its petals, pristine and fragile, seemed to mark the quiet order of my hallway. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the cool, smooth stem. Lilies, I knew, were often symbols of peace or remembrance, but this felt like neither. It felt like a deliberate intrusion, a quiet declaration that my sanctuary was no longer inviolable. My breath hitched. They knew where I lived. They knew I was home. The message was clear, devoid of words, yet screaming with menace. My investigation, now tinged with a raw edge of fear, shifted. I began to seek out information in the less frequented corners of the city, away from the polished glass and steel of the financial district. I needed to understand how the physical manifestations of their illicit trade connected to the ethereal numbers on my spreadsheets. This led me, one moonless night, to the city's underbelly, a forgotten stretch of industrial waterfront. The air here was thick with the scent of brine and diesel, a stark contrast to the sterile air of my office. The low tide had exposed a treacherous path across a narrow inlet, a shortcut known only to a few, leading to a cluster of dilapidated docks. I spotted them then, a small group of figures, hunched and anonymous in the gloom, making a precarious river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders. This was no ordinary shipping. This was the illicit flow, the tangible manifestation of the numbers I chased. It was the distinct sensation of being observed. I didn't see anyone, heard no telltale rustle, but the feeling was undeniable, like a predator's gaze. My blood, which had been thrumming with the thrill of discovery, now turned to ice. They were not just watching my home, my office. They were watching me, here, now. I retreated, my steps carefully placed, my mind racing. The lily, the sedan, the man, and now this. The pieces clicked into a terrifying mosaic. This wasn't just corporate obstruction. This was a deliberate campaign of intimidation from something far more dangerous. The rot I had perceived within the firm was merely a symptom, a conduit for a deeper, more pervasive malignancy. My investigation had ceased to be a quiet intellectual pursuit. It had become a desperate fight for survival, and I was no longer just an accountant. I was a target. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me gasping for breath in the salty night air. The game had changed, and I was no longer just playing defense. To walk away now would be to surrender to the shadows, to allow the insidious tendrils to tighten their grip on everything I held dear. I had spent the morning in a haze of calculated movements, each step a silent declaration of war against an unseen enemy. I had just brewed a second bitter cup of coffee, the aroma doing little to cut through the metallic taste of apprehension in my mouth, when the front door latch clicked. My wife's familiar sigh, followed by the light patter of my daughter's hurried steps, momentarily dissolved the tension that had coiled in my chest. A fragile peace settled, a brief sunlit reprieve. "Daddy," my daughter's voice, a bright bell, rang through the small hallway. She burst into the living room, her school bag slung carelessly over one shoulder, a smudge of paint on her cheek. My wife followed, offering a tired smile. "Hard day?" I asked, meeting her gaze, a silent question passing between us about the quiet hum of anxiety that had become our new normal. She simply nodded, then gestured towards our daughter. Someone left a note on her desk about the school play. She's buzzing. My daughter, however, was already halfway to her room, a whirlwind of youthful energy. Mr. Floppy needs to know my lines. Called out, referring to her worn, one-eared stuffed rabbit, a constant companion since infancy. I heard the soft thud of her school bag hitting the floor, then the rustle of clothes, and the distinct creaking protest of her bed as she climbed onto it. A moment later, a sound unlike her usual joyous chatter cut through the air. My wife and I exchanged a look, our brief tranquility evaporating like mist. My heart, a startled bird, fluttered against my ribs. Lily. I called, my voice tight. No answer. I moved first, a sudden urgency propelling me forward. The hallway seemed to stretch, each step echoing the accelerating drumbeat in my ears. My daughter sat on her bed, frozen, her small hands hovering over Mr. Floppy, who lay propped against her pillow. Her eyes, wide and glistening, were fixed on the rabbit's face. I followed her gaze. The familiar, button-black eyes of Mr. Floppy stared blankly ahead, but one was different. Embedded deeply into the worn fabric, where a button eye should have been, was a minuscule shard of polished obsidian. It glinted with an unnatural, malevolent light, and carved crudely into the rabbit's belly, a symbol almost imperceptible at first, but once seen, impossible to unsee. A twisted, angular glyph, reminiscent of the obscure sigils I had glimpsed within the illicit ledger's margins, a mark that had haunted my periphery for weeks. My breath hitched. My wife gasped from behind me, a low, guttural sound of pure horror. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. This was not a random act. This was a message, surgically precise, delivered into the very heart of our home, a violation that left me breathless. They had been here, they had watched. They knew, had I been too reckless, had my stubborn pursuit of truth condemned my family, the image of my daughter's tear-filled eyes, the innocence shattered, burned into my vision. Then, a different fire ignited within me. The fear, so potent and paralyzing, began to transmute. It hardened, cooled, and sharpened into something fierce and unyielding. This was no longer about abstract figures and corporate malfeasance. This was personal. They had dared to touch what was mine, what was sacred. The line had been crossed, irrevocably, brutally. My hand trembled as I gently took the rabbit from my daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. Her small body shook against mine. That night, after my daughter was finally lulled into a fitful sleep by my wife's gentle singing, I made the arrangements. They would be safe, away from the apartment, away from me for now. The city lights blurred behind me, fading into a distant glow as I ventured deeper into the industrial periphery, where the concrete gave way to marshland and the murmur of the river. I carried a small, sealed satchel, its contents vital, heavy with the weight of my next moves. The obsidian shard, carefully extracted from Mr. Floppy's eye, rested in a small, separate pocket, a grim talisman. The tide was low, revealing a treacherous expanse of slick mud and jagged rocks. The air hung thick with the scent of salt and decay. I had to cross. There was no other way to reach the abandoned dock, where I had stashed the burner phone and the last, uncopied ledger, the one I had feared to keep in the apartment. I began the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders. Each step was an effort, my boots sinking into the yielding mud, threatening to pull me under. The satchel, my precious cargo, pressed against my back, a constant reminder of the stakes. The burden was immense, both physical and metaphorical. I was carrying the weight of my family's safety, the evidence of their monstrous deeds, and the burning certainty of my newfound resolve. They had awakened a predator where they had expected a lamb, and now I would hunt. The silence of my house, after my daughter's cheerful retreat, felt less like peace and more like a vacuum threatening to swallow me whole. Her innocent chatter about Mr. Floppy, her lines for a school play, echoed in the sudden quiet, a stark counterpoint to the grim calculus unfolding in my mind. Each rustle of the leaves outside, each creak of the old floorboards, twisted into a phantom threat. The veiled warnings from my firm's leadership, the subtle tightening of the noose around my professional life, it had all solidified into a chilling certainty. I was utterly alone in this. And being alone, I now understood, meant being vulnerable. The ledger of my life, once so meticulously balanced, was now hopelessly in the red. My career, my reputation, my very freedom, all teetered on the precipice. But it was the thought of my daughter, her bright, trusting eyes, that truly weighted the scales. I couldn't protect her by hiding, I could only protect her by fighting, and I couldn't fight this hydra alone. The tentacles of this syndicate, I now knew, reached far deeper, wrapped tighter than I had ever dared to imagine. My meticulous spreadsheets, my neatly organized files, felt like pebbles against an avalanche. I spent the next 2 days in a haze of careful, deliberate action. My phone, once an extension of my professional self, became an instrument of paranoia. Every call was screened, every text scrutinized. I acquired a burner device, a cheap, anonymous conduit to the undercurrents I now had to navigate. Who knew enough, who cared enough, who had been burned enough to risk the fire again? He had been tenacious, relentless, until the system itself had broken him. He was a long shot, a gamble, but a necessary one. The first attempts at contact were like casting bread upon turbulent waters, hoping for a ripple. An anonymous message left on an obscure online forum, a coded phrase buried in a comment section of an old, forgotten news article about his downfall. I waited, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against my chest. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then a single cryptic reply, a time, a place, and a warning, come alone, no tricks. The designated meeting point was a stretch of forgotten coastline, far from the polished towers of the city, a place where the land surrendered grudgingly to the sea. It was a place where tides sculpted the earth, revealing and concealing with indifferent rhythm. The air was thick, with the scent of brine and damp earth. I carried a waterproof satchel slung across my shoulder, a modest burden yet heavy with the weight of my discoveries. A hard drive containing encrypted files, printouts of the most damning transactions, and my own meticulously crafted analysis connecting the dots. It was my cargo, my proof, my fragile hope. The path dwindled to nothing, dissolving into a treacherous expanse of mud flats and exposed rocks. The tide was out, revealing a skeletal landscape usually submerged. This was the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders he had described. The water, a murky ribbon, snaked through the flats, shallow but deceptive. Each step was a commitment, my boots sinking into the slick, yielding mud. I clutched the satchel tighter, my grip tight. The current, though weak, tugged at my legs, a subtle but persistent resistance. Finally, I reached the other side, my breath ragged, my clothes damp with effort and spray. A figure emerged from the deepening twilight, silhouetted against the fading light. He was older than I remembered, his frame leaner, his shoulders stooped, but there was an unyielding glint in his eyes, a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost, but perhaps not forgotten. He wore a faded, oil-stained jacket and a knitted cap pulled low over his brow. This was the contact. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low rasp cutting through the wind, "you're a long way from your polished office." His gaze was sharp, dissecting, taking in my disheveled appearance, the satchel. "I need your help," I stated, cutting to the chase, my voice steadier than I felt. He let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Help? My helping days are long gone. The only thing I help these days is myself to another quiet evening." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Unless you've got something truly extraordinary, something that can't be swept under the rug like a bad memory." I unzipped the satchel, revealing the hard drive and the thick stack of papers. "This," I said, pulling out a printout of a specific transaction. A series of shell companies funneling funds into an offshore account linked to a defunct shipping company. "Is a thread." I followed it, money laundering on a scale that would make your head spin. He took the paper, his fingers surprisingly delicate as they traced the numbers. His eyes, however, remained skeptical. "Money laundering. Every other junior accountant with a grudge thinks they've stumbled onto the next big thing. What makes yours different, Thomas?" "The names," I pressed. "The amounts and the pattern. It connects to the very top. And it connects to something else, something historical, a series of disappearances on the docks, never solved. They called it the ghost ship incidents." His head snapped up, his posture stiffening. The mention of the ghost ship had struck a nerve. A flicker of something, recognition, resentment, perhaps even a spark of the old fire crossed his face. "The ghost ship," he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "That was my case, the one they buried me under." He looked at me, a new intensity in his gaze. "You're saying this is tied to that? The money trail I've uncovered," I explained, "shows funds moving through the same obscure shell corporations that were linked, however tenuously, to the shipping company at the heart of those disappearances. The dates align too, something that required people to vanish without a trace." He stared at the documents, then at me. "That doesn't add up," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The official narrative was always that it was rival gangs, a turf war gone too far, the wind whipped at his cap. And I think my firm is involved, not directly in the disappearances, I clarified, but in facilitating the laundering, providing the legitimate facade for the dirty money. Threatened. He considered my words, his gaze sweeping over the desolate landscape, as if searching for answers in the shifting sands. I read either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, Thomas, or both. He handed back the paper, his hand brushing mine. Had I made a terrible mistake? His skepticism, his weariness, was a mirror reflecting my own deep-seated fears. What if this was all a wild goose chase, a delusion born of stress and paranoia? What if I had misinterpreted the data, seen patterns where none existed? What if this is the key to everything? He looked away, scanning the horizon. Then back at me, a decision hardening his features. All right, Thomas, you've got my attention. It's a long shot, a crazy theory, but the ghost ship that always stuck in my craw. He took the hard drive. But if I do this, it's on my terms. And you understand, if this blows up, if you're wrong, we both go down, hard. The weight on my shoulders, the cargo of my secret, hadn't lessened, but now perhaps it was shared. The river, once a barrier, now felt like a bridge, tenuous but crossed. The real journey, I knew, had only just begun. The cold embrace of the river still clung to my skin, a phantom chill, even as I emerged onto the opposite bank. The final steps of the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, had been a slow, arduous ballet against the current, each footfall a prayer whispered to the shifting sands beneath. The canvas bag, heavy with the digital ghosts of illicit transactions, dug into my collarbones. A familiar ache now intertwined with the thrum of pure adrenaline. The air, crisp and tasting of salt and mud, offered no comfort, only the stark reality of the shore ahead. My breath plumed in the pre-dawn gloom, a fleeting testament to my presence. The world was a canvas of grays and deep blues, the horizon a bruised line promising a reluctant sun. I scanned the desolate stretch of land reeds, whispering secrets to the wind. Skeletal trees reaching for a sky still heavy with stars. Nothing stirred, yet a prickle crawled up my neck, a discordant note in the quiet symphony of the morning. I took another step, then froze, a glint. A shard of moonlight caught on something metallic, half buried in the damp sand, a few paces from where I'd just climbed out. It was too precise, too alien to the natural debris. A small, spent cartridge casing, polished brass. My stomach clenched, a fist twisting inside me. It wasn't old, the sheen too fresh. My heart, a trapped bird, began a frantic beat against my ribs. They knew, or they were here. My grip tightened on the canvas bag, the edges of the laptop pressing into my hip. Every instinct screamed for flight, but my legs felt like lead. The river, now behind me, felt miles away, an impossible retreat. Two figures, tall and lean, moving with an unnerving economy of motion. They weren't running. Not yet, but advancing, a predatory glide. No words were spoken, no commands shouted. The message was clear in their silent, relentless approach. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and numbers, fractured into primal panic. This wasn't an audit, this was an ambush. The sand gave way beneath my feet, sending me sprawling. A sharp crack echoed through the air, not a gunshot, but the branch of a dead tree snapping under a sudden weight. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, and bolted. Not towards the river, but inland, towards the vague promise of a road I remembered from the outdated map I'd studied. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of soft sand and sharp stones. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp. The cargo of my secret, now abandoned, felt like a phantom weight, the absence almost as heavy as its presence. Behind me, the soft thud of their footsteps grew closer, unnervingly steady. They weren't winded, they weren't rushing, they were hunting. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The first figure was gaining, a long arm outstretched. Abduction then, not a clean kill. What could be worse than death? Finding out what they wanted me for. I veered sharply, throwing myself into a thicket of thorny bushes, ignoring the painful scrapes on my arms and face. The thorns tore at my clothes, but offered a momentary barrier. The pursuer, caught off guard, stumbled, cursing under his breath. It was a guttural sound, devoid of humanity. As he regained his balance, he reached into his jacket pocket. It slipped from his grasp, arcing through the air, before landing with a soft thwack in the sand, just inches from my outstretched hand. Instinct, raw and unthinking, took over. It was a USB drive, but unlike any I had ever seen. Its casing was a dull, metallic gray, with no visible ports or indicators, only a single intricate symbol etched into its surface, a stylized serpent devouring its own tail, an Ouroboros, a peculiar, almost archaic symbol for something so modern. No time to examine it. I twisted, squirming deeper into the thorny embrace of the bushes, the sharp spines a desperate shield. His fingers brushed my arm, a touch that sent shivers of revulsion through me. I let out a cry, a raw, animal sound, and kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin. He grunted, a short, sharp exhalation of pain, and for a fleeting moment, his grip faltered. That was all I needed. I burst from the bushes on the opposite side, leaving shreds of my shirt clinging to the thorns. My legs, though burning, found a new reserve of strength. I could hear the other pursuer now, his footsteps crunching closer, encircling me. They were closing in. The road, it had to be near. Through the thinning trees, I saw a faint, gray line, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wild land. I ran for it, desperation lending wings to my feet. A car, any car, would be a miracle. I burst onto the narrow, deserted road, panting, eyes frantically scanning. Nothing. The world was still asleep, or perhaps just indifferent to my plight. I could hear them emerge from the tree line, their heavy breathing now audible, their figures silhouetted against the nascent glow of dawn. Thomas, a voice called out, low and gravelly, the sound strangely intimate in the vast emptiness. It was the first time they had used my name. They weren't just random thugs, they knew who I was. My meticulous world, once so ordered, now lay shattered around me. This wasn't just evidence. It was a brand, a mark of the beast I had stumbled upon. It was undeniable, a physical manifestation of the corruption plucked directly from the hand of my pursuer. This wasn't merely a document, a spreadsheet, this was theirs, and they wanted it back. My earlier attempts to report, to expose, felt naive, childish. I had thought I was simply uncovering a crime. I was actually poking a sleeping dragon. They weren't interested in silencing me. They were interested in retrieving something from me, or perhaps making me disappear into the labyrinth I had inadvertently exposed. The sheer ruthlessness, the calculated precision of their hunt made me question everything. Had I truly been so foolish as to think I could simply walk away from this with a few files? No, this wasn't just about exposing a syndicate anymore. This was about survival. But it also meant I could never go back. Not to my apartment, not to my firm, not to the life I had so carefully constructed. The river crossing, the initial bridge, had now burned behind me. The real journey, the one into the underground, had begun in earnest. The river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, had etched itself into my sinews, a testament to a desperate pilgrimage. Each shuddering breath I drew on the opposite bank was a victory, a gulp of air stolen from the maw of oblivion. The chill of the water, a lover's cruel embrace, still clung to my skin, a phantom shroud even now, hours later, as I peeled away the sodden layers of my journey. The package, heavy with its illicit truths, lay wrapped in oilskin, hidden beneath a loose flagstone in a forgotten corner of my small garden shed. Its presence, a leaden weight, pressed not on my shoulders anymore, but on the very chambers of my heart. The first light of dawn, a bruised purple, found me at my kitchen table, a lukewarm mug of herbal tea steaming beside a scatter of fragmented notes. The meticulous accountant in me craved order, but the chaos of the night, the mud-slicked scramble, the whispered promises to myself, had left my thoughts a jumbled tapestry. I had done it. I had retrieved the ledger, the one the informant had sworn would seal their fate. My fingers, still faintly numb, traced the outline of my phone. A call to the Internal Ethics Committee, perhaps, a direct approach to the senior partner, armed with irrefutable proof. No, not yet. Not without a fortress of certainty around me. I needed to verify every entry, cross-reference every name, build a case so impermeable, so crystalline, that no amount of corporate obfuscation could shatter it. Every face on the train seemed to hold a secret, every passing car a potential tale. My paranoia, a constant companion these past weeks, had sharpened into an acute, almost painful awareness. I walked into the firm's gleaming lobby, the polished marble reflecting a distorted image of my own weary face. The usual hum of early morning activity felt muted, hushed, as if the air itself held its breath. As I stepped into my department, the usual camaraderie was absent. Heads turned, then swiftly averted. A colleague, usually quick with a jocular greeting, offered only a tight-lipped nod, his gaze flickering nervously away. Had word spread? Had my clandestine activities been detected? Before I could even reach my desk, A messenger, a young man usually tasked with delivering coffee orders, approached me with an envelope. His eyes, usually bright with youthful indifference, were wide with an almost fearful deference. "Mr. Thomas," he stammered, "the senior partner requests your immediate presence in the executive conference room, and the head of security is already there." My breath hitched. The air grew thin, sharp. This wasn't a casual meeting. This was an ambush. I felt the slow, deliberate pulse of a drum beginning to beat somewhere deep within my chest, a rhythm of impending doom. My mind raced, trying to grasp the threads of a narrative that was rapidly unraveling. Had the ledger been compromised? Had my informant been caught? The executive conference room, usually a bastion of hushed power and strategic chess, felt like an interrogation chamber. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the grim faces of the senior partner and the head of security. The senior partner, a man whose smile usually radiated an almost paternal warmth, now wore a mask of stone. The head of security, a former tactical officer whose eyes missed nothing, sat with his arms crossed, a predator surveying its prey. "Thomas," the senior partner began, his voice devoid of its usual geniality, "we have some disturbing matters to discuss." My jaw tightened. I remained standing, a silent challenge. "I'm listening." The head of security pushed a tablet across the table, its screen glowing with a spreadsheet. "This," he replied, his voice flat, "is a detailed breakdown of transactions from an offshore account. An account, Thomas, that was opened using your credentials, your digital signature, and your personal access codes." My gaze fell upon the screen. A series of large, outbound transfers, hundreds of thousands of units, funneled through shell corporations. Each line item was meticulously detailed, date-stamped, authenticated. A hidden folder, naturally. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was corporate espionage. A far graver charge, designed to obliterate my career and reputation. My mind, usually a precise instrument, reeled. A hidden folder, on my drive. I had been so scrupulous, so careful. I remembered the odd sluggishness of my system a few weeks prior, dismissed as a routine software hiccup. And the head of security continued, leaning forward, his voice a low growl, "The final nail, Thomas. A small, encrypted thumb drive, found tucked beneath the false bottom of your desk drawer. It contains, among other things, a complete mirror of the proprietary client data you were supposedly extracting." My desk drawer, the one I had meticulously cleaned out just last week, searching for a misplaced pen, the one I knew with absolute certainty had contained nothing but stationery. "That's a lie," I spat, the words tasting like ash. "Someone planted that, all of it. I'm being framed." The senior partner sighed, a theatrical gesture of disappointment. "Thomas, we had such faith in you, your meticulousness, your dedication, but the evidence is overwhelming. We found your fingerprints on the thumb drive, your digital footprint all over the access logs, your signature on the account opening documents." My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. Fingerprints could be lifted, digital footprints fabricated, signatures forged or overlaid. They had thought of everything. They had built a cage of digital lies around me, meticulously crafted to ensure no escape. Effective immediately, the senior partner announced, his voice regaining a measure of its former authority, "Your employment with the firm is terminated. Your access badges have been deactivated. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings, then off the premises. Furthermore, we will be cooperating fully with the authorities regarding these serious allegations." The world tilted. My career, painstakingly built over 2 decades, lay in ruins. The accusations, a poisonous shroud, would cling to me, suffocating my reputation, tainting every future endeavor. I felt a profound sense of isolation descend, thick and suffocating. My family, how would I explain this to them? How would I protect them from the fallout? The syndicate hadn't just attacked me, they had aimed for my very foundation, severing me from my professional life, my financial stability, my support network. But beneath it, a hardened kernel of resolve ignited. They thought they had broken me. They had merely pushed me to the brink, where the only path left was to fight, tooth and nail, against the monstrous injustice they had wrought. The river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, had been a physical trial. This now was a trial of spirit, and I would not yield. They wanted me isolated? Good. An isolated man with nothing left to lose was a dangerous man indeed. My focus sharpened, a razor's edge. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a different kind of calculation. The world had indeed tilted, but it had not shattered. Not yet. The accusations, a venomous fog, swirled around me, threatening to choke the very air I breathed. My name, Thomas, once a quiet emblem of meticulous order, now felt like a brand scorching with ignominy. Isolation, a cold, vast ocean had swallowed me whole, but deep within its icy depths, a flicker remained a defiant spark. They had stripped me bare, peeled away the veneer of my professional life, my reputation, the comfortable illusion of security. But they had not touched the core, the intricate gears of my mind, the relentless logic that had, ironically, led me to this precipice. My family. The thought was a raw wound, a constant ache beneath the surface of my burgeoning rage. How could I explain this tempest? How could I shield them from the fallout? The question, a relentless drumbeat, fueled a new kind of energy, cold and precise. No longer would I merely react, a pawn in their elaborate criminal game. I would become the architect of their undoing. I retreated to the quiet anonymity of a borrowed, sparsely furnished room. The city's distant hum a muffled lullaby to my frantic thoughts. My tools were not fists or firearms, but the very language they spoke. Numbers. They had underestimated the quiet fury of a man who understood the subtle art of financial dissection. My fingers, usually gliding over crisp ledgers and polished keyboards, now traced invisible pathways on a grimy tabletop. The system, once a fortress of integrity, was merely a grand illusion, a stage for their illicit theater. I saw the hidden levers, the secret panels, the false bottoms. The initial scheme I'd uncovered was merely a tendril, a single grasping root of a monstrous subterranean network. The true beast lay deeper, its tendrils reaching into the highest echelons, cloaked in legitimacy. The true reveal, the insight that crystallized my countermove, came not from a new document, but from a re-evaluation of an old one. A seemingly innocuous transfer, buried deep within a subsidiary's quarterly report, had bothered me for weeks. It was too clean, too perfectly balanced, a financial ghost in the machine. Now, with the weight of my ruined career pressing down, I saw it not as an error, but as a deliberate misdirection. A decoy. The real money, the truly colossal sums, were moving through a parallel, almost entirely invisible channel. A channel that relied on the sheer volume of legitimate transactions to hide its parasitic flow. The key players, the ones at the apex of this putrid pyramid, wouldn't touch the dirty money directly. They would only touch the clean money. The profits after the laundering cycle was complete. My mistake had been chasing the dirty money's entry point. The real exposure lay in tracing the exit point of the clean money back to its ultimate beneficiaries. It was a reversal of strategy, an attack on their fortified stronghold from within. My plan began to unfurl, intricate as a spider's web. I needed to connect a specific, unassailable transaction, a single, undeniable thread of clean money, directly to one of the main orchestrators. Not a shell company, not a proxy, but them. And to do that, I needed a physical ledger, one I knew existed, hidden within a forgotten vault in an abandoned factory on the city's forgotten outskirts. A ledger that detailed the final disbursement points, the true recipients. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth and brackish water as I approached the river's edge. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little comfort, its light swallowed by the thick blanket of clouds. The tides, a rhythmic breath of the earth, were at their lowest, exposing a treacherous path of slick rocks and shifting sand. This was the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders I had been told to find. He was a disgruntled former employee, a cog in their machine who had seen too much, and now sought his own bitter redemption. My shoulders ached under the weight of the canvas bag, a crude imitation of a fisherman's sack, filled not with nets, but with my own carefully prepared cargo, a series of encrypted drives, each containing fragments of the financial mosaic I had painstakingly reassembled. These were my proof, my preemptive strike, designed to detonate if I failed to return. They were insurance, a desperate measure against their ruthlessness. My boots sank into the mud, releasing a foul, organic stench. I stumbled, the precious cargo shifting precariously, my heart racing like a trapped bird. "This is madness," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. I pushed forward. Each step was a calculated risk, the treacherous current tugging at my legs. I could feel the sharp edges of hidden rocks beneath the water, threatening to trip me, to send me sprawling into the murky depths. The other side seemed impossibly far, a distant shore swallowed by the gloom. My contact. He extended a hand, rough and calloused, pulling me onto the bank. Every ghost in the system. Be careful, Thomas. My numbers, they speak too loudly. I nodded, my chest tight, as I reached the original bank. The weight of the oilcloth package now heavy in my hands, a new detail snagged at my mind, a subtle discord in the symphony of deceit. The contact's hand, though rough, bore no trace of the fine lines, the slight tremor I remembered from a fleeting encounter months ago, a casual brush in a crowded corridor at the firm. Wait, that doesn't add up. The contact I'd been exchanging messages with was a different man. This one was a messenger, a proxy. Someone else had orchestrated this meeting, someone who knew my contact, knew my plan, and was now inserting themselves into the equation. My plan, already complex, now twisted into something more dangerous, more intricate. I had anticipated misdirection, but not from an apparent ally. But the package in my hand, the physical ledger, felt real, tangible. It was the keystone. My fingers tightened around it, but they couldn't erase the numbers. And I, Thomas, had finally learned how to make them sing. The river, a slick, coiling serpent in the pre-dawn gloom, seemed to watch me. Its breath was cold on my face as I clambered onto the original bank, the oilcloth package a cumbersome weight across my shoulders. Every muscle ached, not just from the current's relentless tug, but from the invisible burden of what I now carried, both physically and metaphorically. The cold seeped into my bones, yet it was the memory of a touch, not the water, that truly chilled me. The contact's hand. It had been a fleeting impression, a brush of skin as the oilcloth was transferred, but it had snagged in my mind like a burr. A raised ridge, almost imperceptible beneath the calloused thumb. Not a scar, not a ring, but something else. A subtle deformity, perhaps, or the ghost of an old injury. It didn't fit the image I had constructed of the stranger, the quiet ally who had risked so much to meet me at the river crossing at low tide. Cargo on shoulders. I reached the rusted gate of an abandoned factory, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the paling sky. The lock, a simple snap link, yielded to the small key I carried. Inside, the cavernous space swallowed the sounds of the city, leaving only the drip of condensation and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. I carefully unshouldered the package. The oilcloth, damp and gritty, protected not just a hard drive, but a collection of encrypted data sticks. Their contents a digital labyrinth of ledgers, communications, and shell corporations. This was the raw nerve of the syndicate, plucked from their own secure servers, a mirror image of their financial heart. But the data wasn't just for exposure, it was for bait. The hard drive clicked into its port, the data sticks slid into their readers. As the information began to stream, a flood of zeros and ones across my monitor, the image of the contact's hand returned, sharper now. I paused, my breath catching. And now, as I watched the data scroll, a new piece, a fragment of an old public record I dismissed as irrelevant months ago, flickered into view. An obscure charity event from years past, a list of benefactors. One name, a minor donor, had a public photo. And in that photo, shaking hands with a prominent figure now known to be deeply enmeshed in the syndicate, was a man with that exact, peculiar ridge on his thumb. A tremor went through me. The contact at the river wasn't just an ally, he was a double agent. Or worse, a plant from the very beginning, feeding me carefully curated information, guiding my investigation along a predetermined path. The oilcloth package, then, was not just evidence, but a test or a trap. Had I been so easily played, my meticulous nature, my reliance on verifiable data, had blinded me to the oldest trick in the book, a human variable. This was the wait. That doesn't add up moment, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The contact wasn't just not who I thought, he was theirs. Had every step I'd taken been anticipated, there was this entire intricate plan of mine, merely a dance choreographed by my enemies. The thought was a paralyzing poison. My family. Had I endangered them further by trusting this phantom ally? I closed my eyes, picturing my child's innocent face. The warmth of my partner's hand. No, I couldn't afford despair. This new information, painful as it was also a weapon. It meant I had to move faster, anticipate their next move, and turn their own deception against them. I pivoted my plan, the data manipulation becoming even more intricate. My goal was no longer merely to expose, but to draw them out, to make them reveal their full hand. I began crafting a series of phantom transactions, a digital phantom limb of the syndicate's actual operations. These ghost movements would appear to be attempts to shift funds, to launder a new, massive sum of money through a network of shell companies I had painstakingly identified. But buried deep within the metadata, a series of tripwires, digital breadcrumbs that would lead to a public, untraceable server. This server, hosted across a labyrinth of international proxies, contained the real core of my work, a comprehensive dossier, cross-referenced and meticulously annotated, detailing every illicit transaction, every corrupt official, every hidden account. It was a time bomb set to detonate. The phantom transactions were designed to be too tempting to ignore, too large to dismiss as a glitch. They would draw the syndicate's own forensic accountants, their digital hounds, to chase the false scent. And in doing so, they would inadvertently trigger the public release. The public reveal wasn't just a threat, it was a promise that if I fell, the truth would still emerge. Next, the covert communication. I pulled out a burner phone, its screen a dull glow in the factory's gloom, a series of pre-written, encrypted messages. The first went to the detective. A single, cryptic phrase, "The net is cast, watch the tides." Attached was a compressed, encrypted file containing the coordinates of the public server and the trigger conditions. Her role was crucial, to be ready to act the moment the data went live, to mobilize the legitimate forces of law. The second message, even more carefully worded, went to the stranger, the one who had helped me previously, before the river crossing. I deliberately omitted the detail about the thumb. I couldn't risk revealing my knowledge of the new deception just yet. Instead, I sent a modified set of instructions, nudging them towards a specific peripheral observation point, a location that would allow them to witness the syndicate's reaction without being directly involved in the digital fallout. If the river contact truly was compromised, this would test the stranger's loyalty without putting them in direct harm's way, at least not yet. It was a gamble, but I had no other choice. Every potential ally was now a potential liability. The final message was to a pre-selected network of independent journalists, carefully vetted over months. A dead man's switch, linked to my own personal server, set to release the full dossier if I failed to check in within a specific window. A final, desperate safeguard. I was a man playing chess against ghosts, against a hydra that grew two heads for everyone I attempted to sever. The doubt gnawed at me again. What if I had miscalculated? What if the syndicate had already anticipated this countermove? But looking back was not an option. My family's future, my own survival, depended on the flawless execution of this perilous dance. The trap was set, its invisible wires stretched taut across the digital landscape, waiting for the first unsuspecting step. Every muscle ached, not just from the current's relentless tug, but from the invisible burden I'd carried across that murky divide. My feet, still numb from the chill, found purchase on the damp earth. The cargo, a tightly bound bundle of my truth, felt heavier than any stone. I paused, lungs burning, the taste of metallic fear and river water mingling on my tongue. The city, a distant constellation of indifferent lights, awaited. My watch, its face cracked from some forgotten impact, showed the hour creeping towards the morning. Not much time. The air, thick with the promise of rain, pressed down on me as I stumbled away from the water's edge, each step a testament to a will forged in the crucible of fear. A quick change in a forgotten alleyway, the cold water from a public tap a brutal awakening against my skin, and the damp, familiar suit felt like armor. The oilcloth bundle, now tucked into a reinforced briefcase, was my shield and my sword. The grand hall of the firm's annual gala shimmered under the chandeliers, a deceptive tableau of success and power. The air hummed with polite chatter, the clink of glasses, and the faint, sweet scent of money. I was a ghost in their feast, a predator in their well-groomed garden. I spotted them almost immediately. The senior executive, a man whose smile could charm birds from trees while his eyes plotted their downfall, stood by a crystal ice sculpture, his hand resting casually on the arm of a junior colleague. Nearby, the strategist, a woman of sharp angles and even sharper intellect, held court, her gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving precision. A tremor ran through my hand as I adjusted the cuff of my shirt. This was it. But then I saw a young analyst, fresh-faced and eager, listening intently to the senior executive's smooth pronouncements. My family's faces flashed in my mind, their safety the only compass I had left. The doubt vanished, replaced by a crystalline resolve. I moved with a practiced nonchalance, navigating the labyrinth of tables and mingling guests. My destination, the main stage, where a large, translucent screen displayed rotating corporate achievements. It was the centerpiece of the evening, meant to project an image of impeccable integrity. I had other plans for its projection. "Thomas, I made it." A colleague, his face flushed with champagne, clapped me on the shoulder. "Thought the river might have claimed I." He chuckled. Oblivious, I offered a tight smile. Couldn't miss the main event. My eyes, however, were fixed on the senior executive, who was now making his way towards the stage, a microphone being handed to him. The timing was perfect. My fingers, surprisingly steady, slipped a small, modified USB drive into a discreet port I had located days ago, hidden behind a decorative panel near the stage's main control hub. A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed the giant screen. The rotating images paused, then vanished, replaced by a stark black background. A hush fell over the room, a ripple of confused murmurs spreading through the crowd. The senior executive mid-sentence faltered. His eyes, initially annoyed, narrowed as he saw the screen. Then a single line of text appeared, stark white against the black. "The illusion of prosperity." Gasps erupted. The strategist from across the room spun around. Her eyes like chips of ice, searching, calculating. Her gaze found mine. For a moment the world narrowed to just us, a silent duel of wills. I gave her nothing but a steady, unyielding stare. Then the data began to flow. Not just abstract numbers, but a cascading flood of shell company names, offshore accounts, wire transfer records, and the true beneficiaries, not the legitimate entities, but a web of aliases and linked individuals, all pointing back to the very people who now stood frozen in their expensive suits. Each transaction, each illicit flow of capital, was illuminated with damning clarity, projected for all to see. The sheer scale of it, the audacity, painted itself across the screen in brutal, undeniable strokes. "Ladies and gentlemen," I projected my voice, surprisingly strong over the rising din. "For too long, this firm has been a conduit. This isn't just a breach of trust. It's a betrayal of everything we claim to stand for." The senior executive's face contorted, a mask of fury replacing his polished charm. "This is preposterous. A malicious attack. Security, shut this down." His voice boomed, but it was edged with panic. But it was too late. As he shouted, the screen shifted, displaying not just the raw data, but a series of interconnected diagrams, visual representations of the syndicate's hierarchy, their connections to legitimate businesses, and their methods of laundering. Names, roles, dates, it was all there, undeniable. My own work, years of forensic accounting, distilled into a weapon of truth. "The server farm in the abandoned factory," I continued, pointing to a diagram that highlighted a specific location. "The shell corporations registered in the islands. The inflated invoices, the phantom projects. It all leads here." I gestured to the senior executive and the strategist, who now looked like cornered animals. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the main entrance. The senior executive, seeing the inevitable, made a desperate lunge towards the stage, but he was intercepted by a swift, unyielding hand. The strategist, ever calculating, tried to melt into the crowd, but she too was quietly but firmly surrounded. The room erupted into a cacophony of shouts, gasps, and the urgent commands of the arriving authorities. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from the raw, exhilarating surge of accomplishment. I watched as the senior executive was led away, his eyes blazing with a hatred that promised retribution. The data, my data, was now irrevocably out. I had ensured its dissemination through multiple encrypted channels. A digital dead man's switch activated the moment I connected the drive. There was no turning back, no way to bury this truth again. I felt a profound exhaustion settle over me, bone deep and absolute. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a tremor in my limbs. The battle was won, the truth unveiled. But as I looked at the chaos, the flashing lights, the grim faces of the agents securing the scene, I knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. My gaze drifted to the now static screen, displaying the final, damning flowchart. The river crossing, the clandestine meetings, the constant fear it had all led to this single, explosive moment. I had walked through fire, and I was still standing. The roar of the senior executive's voice, once a polished instrument of command, cracked like splintered ice. His face, ruddy with rage and fear, was a grotesque tableau beneath the flickering projection. The raw data, the damning ledgers, the coded communications, all blossomed on the screen, undeniable. I watched, a quiet observer amidst the sudden, cacophonous collapse of a carefully constructed lie. The room erupted into a symphony of gasps and muttered curses, the polished veneer of corporate decorum shattering into 1,000 shards. Then the true chaos began. Sirens, distant at first, then a mournful crescendo, bled through the thick office walls. Uniformed figures, then plainclothes investigators with eyes like flint, swept through the corridors. The senior executive, his bluster evaporated into a pathetic whimper, was led away, his hands clasped behind him. Other colleagues, faces pale and drawn, followed suit, their shock giving way to a dawning comprehension of ruin. I stood by the projector, the hum of its fan a small, persistent buzz against the ringing in my ears, a phantom echo of the past months. A profound exhaustion settled upon me, a weight far heavier than any ledger. My muscles ached, not from physical exertion, but from the relentless tension that had coiled within me for so long. A detective, a woman with a gaze that missed nothing, approached. His eyes, shadowed with the long nights of his own pursuit, held mine. "Thomas," he answered, his voice low, a balm after the storm. "It's over. My name is clear, more than clear. I saved us months of work." A small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. It was a simple statement, yet it felt like the breaking of a dam. The accusations, the veiled threats, the cold shoulders, the insidious doubt that had gnawed at my resolve all dissipated in that single, quiet affirmation. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me, so potent it threatened to buckle my knees. I had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed but intact. The firm, once an impenetrable monolith of finance, crumbled with astonishing speed. News cycles spun with frenzied headlines, the scandal a ravenous beast consuming every detail. Reputations, carefully cultivated over decades, dissolved like sugar in hot tea. The edifice of prestige, built on a foundation of deceit, collapsed into dust and public outrage. I watched it all from a distance, the relentless churn of the media a stark contrast to the quiet, internal landscape of my own recovery. My phone, once a silent sentinel of my isolation, now buzzed incessantly with calls from investigators, prosecutors, even former colleagues. Their voices tinged with a strange mix of apology and awe. But the victory, though undeniable, tasted of ash. The professional costs were immediate and immense. My career, as I knew it, was a casualty of war. The meticulous world of numbers, once my sanctuary, now felt tainted, a labyrinth I had navigated only to find its heart corrupted. The emotional toll, too, was a deep, persistent ache. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by the ghost of threats, the phantom presence of surveillance. My family, though safe, carried the scars of my ordeal, a quiet worry etched into their expressions, a fear that lingered in their eyes even now. I had protected them, yes, but at what price to the peace we once shared? Days bled into weeks. The initial flurry of arrests settled into the methodical grind of legal proceedings. The detective kept me informed, a courtesy extended to a reluctant ally. He spoke of further raids, of key players apprehended in distant ports, their vast networks of illicit trade unraveling under the sustained pressure of international law enforcement. The money trails led us everywhere. "Thomas," he'd said during one call, his voice tight with satisfaction. And my initial data, the patterns I spotted, were the linchpin. Yet, a subtle unease persisted, a faint discordant note in the symphony of justice. During one debriefing, as a different investigator meticulously outlined the assets seized, the names of those incarcerated, a casual mention of a shell corporation's ultimate beneficiary caught my attention. It was a name that had surfaced briefly in my early, desperate searches, dismissed then as a peripheral entity, too vast, too nebulous to be connected directly to the firm's specific scheme. Now, it was confirmed as a significant node in the syndicate's web, a spider in a much larger, more intricate silken trap. I found myself one twilight evening by the water's edge, far from the city's glare. The tide was ebbing, revealing the muddy flats, the skeletal remains of old jetties. I watched the water recede, a slow, inexorable pull, and a memory sharp and visceral surfaced. It was a moment etched in my soul, a stark symbol of the burdens I had carried, the perilous journey I had undertaken, alone and unafraid through the shifting, treacherous landscape of truth and deception. The physical act of crossing, the unseen currents, the fear of losing my footing and plunging into the murky depths, felt like a perfect mirror to the mental and moral tightrope I had walked. The syndicate's tendrils were being pruned, yes, but the root, I sensed, remained. The world felt safer, yet not entirely cleansed. My own path forward was obscured by the receding tide of my old life. The numbers I once chased were silent now, replaced by the persistent echo of sirens and the quiet hum of a mind forever changed. I was free, yes, but the freedom felt less like liberation and more like an empty expanse waiting to be filled. The city, a titan of glass and steel, receded behind me, a memory etched in jagged lines against a bruised sky. Justice had by all accounts been served. The headlines screamed of arrests, of assets frozen, of a vast criminal enterprise dismantled. My colleagues, those few who had not been tainted, spoke in hushed, reverent tones of my courage, my meticulous hand in its undoing. Yet the victory tasted of ash, a faint discordant note in the symphony of justice. It was the Serene Shore's Benevolent Trust, a name I knew, a dormant charitable entity, ostensibly affiliated with my former firm, a dusty corner of its sprawling financial empire, long forgotten, rarely mentioned. A shiver, colder than any threat, traced its way down my spine. It was a ghost, a shell within a shell, a perfect, unremarkable camouflage. This quiet revelation festered. It was not a grand twist, no sudden betrayal by a trusted ally, but a far more insidious truth. The corruption had not merely infiltrated the firm, it had grown from its very roots, twisting its benevolent gestures into conduits for ill-gotten gains. The firm itself, or at least the architecture it provided, had been a willing, if unwitting, accomplice. This was the final, chilling piece of the mosaic, showing not just the crime, but the depth of the institutional rot. My doubt, that persistent, gnawing worm, now had its answer, a truth both sickening and clarifying. My wife's hand found mine, her touch a grounding force amidst the swirling anxieties. Her eyes, still holding the ghost of fear, now shone with a resilient light. We had walked through fire, and the embers still glowed within us, a constant reminder of how close we had come to being consumed. My son, though too young to grasp the full horror, had sensed the shift in our world, his laughter sometimes punctuated by a sudden, searching gaze. My daughter, older, understood more, her quiet strength mirroring her mother's. We were a different family now, forged in the crucible of peril. "It's time," my wife said, her voice a soft current against the murmur of the river. The air, crisp and clean, carried the scent of salt and damp earth. Our belongings, pared down to essentials, were bundled and strapped, not an escape but a deliberate passage. A new life demanded a new landscape, a physical manifestation of the internal shift. With a deep breath, I hoisted a canvas bag onto my shoulder, its weight a familiar burden, yet different now. My wife followed, a smaller bundle balanced with practiced ease, her gaze fixed on the distant, verdant shore. My children, each with a small pack, walked beside us, their bare feet sinking into the mud. This was the river crossing at low tide, cargo on shoulders, a silent ritual of severance and hope. Each step was deliberate, a conscious leaving behind of the old world. The mud sucked at our feet, making progress slow, but there was no rush. This was our pace now, measured and mindful. I watched my son stumble slightly, and my daughter instinctively reached out, steadying him. A quiet strength had bloomed in them too, an unspoken understanding of resilience. The other side felt different, the air lighter, the earth firmer beneath our feet. We walked for miles, following a winding track that led away from everything familiar towards a quieter existence. My skills, once honed for the pursuit of profit, now yearned for a different purpose. I would not return to a system that could so easily be corrupted from within. Instead, I found myself drawn to a different kind of calculation, one that measured impact, not dividends. I began to explore avenues in public service, a quiet but unwavering resolve taking root. There were organizations, smaller and less glamorous perhaps, but dedicated to financial oversight, to protecting the vulnerable from the very machinations I had uncovered. It was a different kind of accounting, one where the numbers told stories of integrity or its stark absence, and where the goal was not accumulation but rectification. My wife called me in for supper, the aroma of a simple meal drifting on the evening breeze. The laughter of my children, unrestrained and genuine, was the truest currency I now possessed. The danger was gone, yet the vigilance remained, a quiet hum beneath the surface of my new life. We were not entirely whole, not yet, but we were rebuilding, brick by careful brick, on a new horizon, cautious but undeniably hopeful. The past had forged me, but the future, unwritten and uncertain, beckoned with the promise of purpose, a quiet, unwavering commitment to the truth, wherever it might lead.